Bonsoir et merci. First of all, I really want to congratulate you for the Pacte d'Excellence. I must say I've been very impressed. I think it's a great example of how we can give school back to society, where it really belongs. And that's really what I want to talk about it also this evening. I'm going to start with a few thoughts on the world of tomorrow. It's so much easier to educate young people for our past and for their future. And as parents, sometimes we are part of the problem, not part of the solution. You know, we get very anxious when our children no longer learn things that we felt were so important for us. Or even more so when they learn things that we don't understand. Teachers sometimes are more inclined to teach how they were taught than how they were taught to teach. And as a policymaker, you can easily lose an election over education, but you never win an election over education because it takes so much time to translate good ideas into better results. And that's, again, I think, one of the things that makes the Pacte d'Excellence so important, that it builds coherence into educational processes. It's not about tomorrow in the next election cycle. There's a future of Belgium. And if you think about that future, you know, about 10 years ago, everybody got the world's knowledge into their fingertips. The smartphones arrived. A few years later, the virtual world and the real world began to integrate. And suddenly we were all connected. But while that made a lot of things easier, it also made a lot of things much more demanding. I'll give you an example. When you think about literacy, reading, teaching reading in the past was quite easy. You teach people the techniques to extract knowledge from a text, and when they didn't know the answer to a question, you can tell them, look it up in an encyclopedia, and you can trust the answer to be true. Today, you look up your work on Google and you find 50,000 answers for your question, and nobody tells you what's right and what is wrong, what is true and what is not true. Literacy is no longer about extracting knowledge. Literacy is about constructing knowledge, building something. Very different kind of skill set, requiring a very different demand for teaching. And then also, you know, on the one hand, we can say everybody is connected these days, that's great. But the kind of social media that we often experience, they connect us with people who think like us, who walk like us, who look like us. It's actually much more difficult for young people today to experience the diversity of society than it was the case 10 years ago or even 20 years ago. Those things are putting fundamentally new challenges to education systems. The kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, are precisely the kind of things that have become easy to digitize, to automate. That's really the challenge of today. If you want some data on this, you have the majority of 15-year-olds in Belgium who say, I feel really, really bad if I'm not connected. Being part of this connected world has become like drinking water or breathing air. The time that 15-year-olds spent online outside of a school day has dramatically increased between 2012 and 2015. Across the board, but also in Belgium. The virtual world is becoming the real world for a lot of people these days. That's the world in which we live today and the world which will shape tomorrow. If you think just about, what this future really means, the one question, of course, in all our minds is, what should people learn for tomorrow's world? Knowledge is always going to be important. Clearly, people have to know something, but the kind of knowledge that makes you successful has dramatically changed. If you think about mathematics, it's not about formulas and equations anymore, memorizing those. It's about being able to think like a mathematician, to be able to translate the real world into the mathematical world and use the tool of mathematics to shape our problems. Being able to think like an historian, History is not about names and places and people. History is about understanding how the narrative of a society has emerged, developed, advanced, sometimes unravels when the context changes. What does it mean for the times in which we live today? Thinking like a scientist is not about accumulating lots of knowledge of biology and chemistry, but being able to design an experiment, understand what questions are scientifically investigable and what are not. And again, it's much harder to teach you to think like a scientist than to just put lots of knowledge on you in terms of science. And knowledge is just the beginning. The world no longer rewards us just for what we know. Now, Google knows everything. The world rewards us for what we can do with what we know. That's the big differentiator today. When we talk about skills, often we talk about cognitive skills, curiosity, creativity, and maybe critical thinking. But actually, the kind of skills that matter most in tomorrow's world are social and emotional skills. Courage, leadership, empathy, openness, collaboration, social skills. It's easy to say, really, really hard to do. Again, in education, we talk a lot about social skills, but at the end of the day, we put people in behind individual desks, and at the end of the year, we test whether you're better than your neighbor. Now, it's not the way you actually develop the kind of social skills that are mattering for tomorrow. And last but not least, it's about attitudes and values. Success is no longer just about teaching and learning something, but it's about developing a reliable compass and the navigation skills that actually allow you to move through this increasingly complex, volatile, ambiguous world. That's the challenge of today. Orientation is something that young people have to find among themselves. And if you think about this, competency is really our capacity to mobilize our cognitive, social, and emotional resources to continue to be open to the novelty. And if you think about the kind of competencies that matter most, of course, the first thing we all talk about is being innovative now, creating something of intrinsic positive worth, thinking a thought that nobody else has thought, connecting the dots where the next innovation is going to come from now. That capacity is going to be crucially important. In one way, the advent of artificial intelligence pushes us to think much harder what makes us truly human. Once again, the kind of things that are easy to teach, easy to test, are disappearing very, very rapidly. Being able to manage tensions and dilemmas. The world is no longer black and white, good and bad. More and more, we need to navigate between conflicting interests, understanding the divergence of interests, our own and those of others. Being able to manage them, and then taking action, mobilizing responsibility. Those are critical competencies to be successful in tomorrow's world. Being able to think for yourselves and at the same time being able to work with others, people who are different from you, who think differently from you. What does it mean for teaching and learning? Well, one of the things that we really see is that the capacity to be open for the novelty. We are very good in education to teach young people the wisdom of our times, to give to the next generation what we know. It's actually much harder to create the openness among people, to question the established wisdom of our times, to be able to look around the next corner, to see the novelty, the ideas where the next generation is going to come from. And if nobody is going to accept that they may lose their job because a robot is going to take that work over if they don't feel they have the knowledge and skills to be prepared for the next one. Our willingness to embrace change very much depends on the kind of skills that we bring with us. So that's the world in which we live. That's the education that is required from people. Think about knowledge. Think about attitudes. Think about skills. Think about values. The capacity of people to create a new world, not to learn for our past, but for their future. So when talking about how to create this world, let me start with actually debunking some methodologies that often obstruct our view, that prevent us from looking into the future. The first thing that people often say is, that poverty is destiny. The circumstances around us, our families, our schools, determine what we're going to get in terms of learning outcomes. I just show you one slide from our PISA comparisons that is very instructive. On this slide, I basically mark the learning outcomes by decile of social background. This is different from just ranking countries. If I would have, just show you the rank order of countries, you would tell me immediately, well, you compare apples with oranges. Some countries are wealthy, some are less so, some have a more privileged context, some are less so. So what I'm doing here is I take all of this out. The students marked by the red squares have the same family background, same social background, same income across countries. And what you can see is that those students, on the vertical axis, you see the PISA scores. Those students perform very differently depending on the country where they go to school. If you look, for example, the 10% most disadvantaged students in Belgium, they fall very, very far behind. If you go just 2 columns to the right, you can see the 10% most disadvantaged students in Vietnam, a rather poor country, do as well as the average student in Belgium. That shows us poverty need not be destiny. Actually, it is possible in education to provide every student with a good kind of learning environment and opportunity and to achieve good results. Estonia, another of those countries where disadvantaged students have great result in education. Very important. Poverty need not be destiny. It is, of course, very difficult and demanding to build a new kind of environment for students from disadvantage, but it is possible. And we can also see I marked already the countries. We can see some of the factors that are behind this. On the surface, we seem to do a lot for fairness in education. You can see in this slide, for example, that we make classes generally smaller for schools with more disadvantaged children. Now we give more teachers to schools in disadvantage. And that sounds the right thing to do. Those kids who need more help get more teachers. But that's only half of the story. Once you open that black box in a school and look towards the quality of teaching and teachers, you see a very different picture. You can see actually that the most disadvantaged students on the left side face the greatest shortage of experienced teachers. And the children from the wealthy background, they have access to the best teachers. It should be the other way around. When I said before, Vietnam does such a great job in getting, the disadvantaged students with towards good results. What do they do differently? Well, actually, they do a lot to attract the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms. And they do a lot to get the best principals in the most difficult schools. If you're a vice principal in a high-performing school, one of the really prestigious schools, and if you want to become principal one day, the system will tell you that's a great aspiration, but first help us turn around one of the lowest performing schools. The same for the teacher. If you're a great teacher with a good class, they'll ask you to teach a class in more difficult circumstances. They are constantly looking towards using the best resources for the students who need them most. Many countries in that picture, but on average, it looks the other way around. On the surface, we seem to spend more on disadvantage, but when we look closely, actually our systems often reinforce, not moderate, education inequality. And that's one of the things where I've been most impressed by the Pacte d'Excellence. It makes an attempt to change those dynamics. But it is not easy to do in practice, but there are some very good examples how to do that. When you think about what you can do about this, you can actually see the system as a system. A school system is more than, thousands of schools or hundreds of schools. A school system is one that actually sees what happens in other classrooms, that helps teachers to look outwards to the next classroom, that helps schools to look outwards to the next schools. A system that gives schools the tools and the empowerment to change their future. In a way, another thing that I've really been quite inspired by the Pacte Excellence, that it actually gives students responsibility to think about their future, to develop their own plans. How are we addressing the kind of problems that we face? And to be responsible for this. It's another highlight of high-performing education systems throughout the world, that the ownership for progress lies with the people, not with, a prescriptive environment telling people exactly what to do and how to do it, but actually giving people empowerment and ownership over the solutions. Pairing high and low performing schools. One of the things that you don't do in Belgium, but that many high performing education systems do, is actually they try to carefully look. Here's a great school with very good results. Here's a school that needs help, and they bring them together. Some of those schools, if you're having great results, they will give you more resources, more money. You can hire more expertise, more resources, but you can spend those resources only in a school with very poor results. Looking at success at a system level. And I'm going to show you later results. Some countries have become very, very good at this. In Belgium, also in the French community, about 50% of the performance variation lies between schools. In Estonia, Finland, it's 5%. That's something very, very important, to build sort of an environment where the school is working as a system and where parents have the tools and resources as well. Another myth is that, it's all about immigrants. Now, it's easy to say that, you put more immigrants into a school system and suddenly the results decline. Actually, there's no evidence to support that hypothesis. Our data show no relationship whatsoever between the share of immigrants in an education system and the quality of the school system, even after you account for the country where students come from. The country where you go to school has always a much greater influence on your success at school than the country where you come from. And what we often forget in a kind of, debate, we often see the students who have certain difficulties. We never see the special talents. In fact, our PISA results show that the share of students with excellent results is as high among immigrants than it is among students without an immigrant background. So again, of course, diversity poses huge challenges for education systems and schools. I don't want to, make those challenges smaller. But we can see some education systems that have become very, very good at addressing those challenges. If you go to the province of Ontario in Canada, for example, you'd see that they have very diverse classrooms. There's about 40% of students with an immigrant background, but they also have 40% of teachers with an immigrant background. And those teachers understand their students, they understand their history and all of this, and can actually engage with them in very different ways. And then, money. That's, of course, always something that we think about. Solving problems requires money. But actually, when you look at this chart, you can see money only makes a difference up to a point. You can see that the yellow line shows if you're very poor, spend very little on education, spending more can generate better outcomes. But your country, as most OECD countries, is well beyond the point where just adding more of the same is going to make any difference. It's becoming much more important to think about how do we utilize resources? How do we ensure that our best resources arrive at the children where they can make most of a difference? And it's the same with time. There are huge differences in the learning time that students invest. In blue, I've marked the hours of instruction that students get, and in yellow, the time they spend learning outside school. Homework, tutoring, lots of things. And you can see there is a world of difference. You look at the United Arab Emirates, students spend close to 60 hours learning. Huge amount of time. And then you look to Finland, it's only little more than half that time. Huge differences in the hours of instruction. But when you look at productivity in the education system, now what students learn per hour of instruction, you can see basically in the case of Finland, students learn a lot in very little time. And in the United Arab Emirates, students learn very little in a lot of time. It's not the volume of learning time, it's the quality of instruction that really drives differences across countries. And we need to think harder about how do we use the most precious resource in education best, and that is students' time. Now, everything else we can add to the system. And I want to come to this point in a little bit more detail. On this chart, I show you on the vertical axis the student-staff ratio. Now, that's basically how generous are you in your education system. The lower you rank on this, Belgium is a good example, the more generous you are in providing more teachers for every 100 students. But I mark something else. On the horizontal axis, I show you the size of classes. And you can see, for example, you look at Belgium and China. Both are quite generous in terms of teacher supply. Now, Belgium even more so. But there's a huge difference. In Belgium, there are lots of teachers, relatively speaking, and the classes are very small. In China, there are lots of teachers, but the classes are very big. And now the first thing you might think, well, you know, Belgium is much smarter. You know, it uses lots of people in order to make lots of classes small. You have lots of programs, lots of choice. You can choose between different kind of activities in schools, and it looks very kind of convenient for teachers. But there's a price to this. It means that teachers in Belgium often have very little time to do other things than teaching, much less than teachers in China. Teachers in Shanghai and China teach between 11 and 16 hours per week, and they spend a lot of time with individual students. Now, they have a very large class, but they spend out of the classroom a lot of time with individual students. They spend a lot of time with other teachers. They observe at least one lesson every week. They take part in professional learning communities. They invest in research. They have plenty of things to do beyond teaching. That's what the price of small classes is about. Now, in a way, making classes smaller has meant that teachers have very less time than to do other things than teaching. And those activities can become really important. All I want to show you here is really two countries using similar resources in very different ways. And the degree of professionalism often depends on this. Now you might tell me, well, perhaps, smaller classes are not so much more effective, but they make teachers happier in their work. It makes it easier for teachers. No? Well, actually, when you look at this, when you look at this in more detail, we could not find in our surveys any relationship between the job satisfaction of teachers and the size of classes. No? If you ask me, well, if it's not the size of class and maybe the money, what makes teachers satisfied with their work? No? There is actually an answer to that question. And the answer is actually quite simple. The single most important predictor for teachers' satisfaction with their work and job is the degree of professionalization in the system. What do I mean by this? 3 things. The first thing is teacher knowledge. No? That's obvious. What teachers know of their subject is the first thing students find out. What teachers know about how students learn that subject. But third, students, the knowledge of teachers of their students. No? And in Belgium, actually, teachers don't have much of a chance to really know and learn to know about their students because, they teach 1 hour here and another hour there. They run from many classes, but they don't spend much time with an individual student. But that knowledge is one of the key predictors for a teacher's job satisfaction, self-efficacy, and so on. The second factor is about professional autonomy. What room of maneuver do I have to become an effective designer? And the third thing is about the collaborative culture. Those 3 factors are much more powerful predictors of the fact whether teachers are happy with their job, whether they believe in their own abilities as teachers, and even of the status of the teaching profession. Think about this. The status of the teaching profession in society depends a lot on those kinds of factors, how we treat our teachers. Very important factor, and I'm going to come back to this in just a moment. And then there are other factors. When we ask students once, what do you think makes you successful in a subject like mathematics? The majority of Belgium students said, that's very easy. It's all about talent. If I'm not a genius, I'm going to study something else. What does it tell about the education system? It's the mirror of an education system that actually sorts students. You don't feel any empowerment, you can't do anything, you will end up where your talent brought you. If you ask that very same question to a student in the Netherlands, or in Finland, or in Singapore, or in Japan, 9 out of 10 students will tell you, if I study really, really hard, I trust my teacher is going to help me and I'm going to be successful. They see an education system around them that does whatever it takes to help them to succeed. Think about this. If you are not successful students in Belgium, the system tells you, okay, just repeat the school year, do the same thing once more. No? And you have almost 50% of students up to the PISA age that have gone through that experience. No? Great repetition. Very easy, very convenient for a school, just to pass the problem on to the next teacher the next school year. But actually, one of the things you should think about is, this is hugely expensive for your education system. No? It's not expensive for the school because the school gets paid one another year. It's not so expensive for the ministry because the ministry's costs are contained. But it costs your society about 35,000 euro in Belgium. One person repeating one school year. Because those people will participate 1 year less later in life of work and so on. You add it all up, it's a huge amount of money. Imagine you give a tiny fraction of those resources to the teachers to actually prevent dropout. And that means to diagnose students very early on, understand how different students learn differently and embrace that diversity with differentiated practices. No? I know that's the ambition of the Pacte, and I think it's a very, very important ingredient of it. Great repetition is the reflection of a mindset of sorting. Only some students can learn. Some students learn faster. And actually, a good education system is about the deep belief that every student can learn and that the system has to figure out how do different students learn differently and to support students differently. None of the high-performing education systems knows great repetition of any kind. None. Wherever in the world you look, that is something I think that is very, very important to overcome. And it's hugely expensive. And it frames the beliefs of students in what makes them successful. And it frames the attitudes of teachers. No? In my country, Germany, they don't use great repetition so much, but they use tracking. They send students to different types of schools. When you're age 10, they tell you, well, you did well in school, so we're going to send you to a gymnasium, and then you go to university and you become a knowledge worker. And to the other students, they say, well, you didn't do so well, you better go to a vocational school and you're going to end up working for the knowledge workers. No? At age 10, when we actually know from research that the prognostic validity of any indictment is close to zero. No? But it's very similar in its effect on great repetition. It creates the mindset among students, it's not me, I can't do anything about it. And it creates a mindset among teachers, I have the right lesson, but got the wrong students. That's a very, very important ingredient and lesson that we take from this. So, having talked about some of those myths, let me talk about some of the factors that are really, really important. The first sounds so simple, and that is about making education a true priority. Now, everybody talks about education, how important education is. But, the test comes to the truth when you have to decide, do I want my child to become a teacher or, an engineer or a lawyer? How do we pay our teachers? How do we treat our teachers? Do we treat them as professionals or, as workers in an industry. And actually, there's some data on this. We ask teachers themselves how they feel valued in society. You can see in a country like Singapore or Korea or Finland, the vast majority of teachers feel valued by society. My children go to school in France, and it's only 5 in 100 of teachers who feel that the work they do every day is respected by society. Imagine that. Imagine you do a job where you don't feel that society supports you. But remember where that respect comes from. Teacher professionalism is a big thing. Now you can say, well, these are just teachers' views, does it really matter? But actually it's one of the most powerful predictors for results on the PISA test, the respect and status that the teaching profession has. And the status of the teaching profession is not something that comes from the outside. It's often a function of the way in which we design our education systems. Very, very important factor on this. The second has to do with equity. I know you devote a lot of attention to this in the Pacte, and I really think that is one of the cornerstones of success today, because equity was always important. No? Education has always been the level playing field that gives people opportunities in life. But it's never been as important today as today. No? People at the high end of the skill distribution never had the life chances they enjoy today. People at the low end of the skill distribution have never fared the penalties that they have today. In the past, we treated every student in the same way, and it was the problem of the student, and we accepted inequality. And maybe in the past it was easier to accept because our societies only needed a few well-educated people. Today we really need everyone. And we need to we've shifted from equality to equity and basically creating conditions that lift, give more resources to students with greater needs. But that's only half of the success. Formula-based funding, all of those instruments are available and so on, but ultimately it's about removing the obstacles to inequality. Things like mastery learning, finding out that students learn differently and supporting that differences. If you are a teacher in Finland, you have 35% of instruction time that you can devote outside the classroom setting. You have a lot of opportunity to engage with students outside the classroom setting. That is the future. In the 21st century, we have to move from, equity, allocating resources to needs, to fairness, removing the obstacles now. And I think the same is true with, society at large. In the past, democracy was about, giving people equal, making people equal. Today, it's the right to be equal. Today, democracy is about the right to be different. And the same is true in education, understanding those kinds of differences. And that is, again, reflected in school results. What you can see very clearly in Belgium is that a huge part of the performance variation lies between schools. As a parent, you've got to worry, where do I send my child, If you are in Finland on the other side, only 5% of the performance variation lies between schools. Every school succeeds. Because every school knows what every other school has been doing. And every school learns from another school. If you're a school principal in Finland, you spend 70% of your time leading your school, and 30% of your time you work in the ministry. The Ministry of Education is not an administration there, but it's largely composed of people who are actually leading schools, who work with their colleagues, and who understand the needs of other schools, and who work together every day. Schools know what other schools are doing. There's a huge kind of capacity to mobilize and share the best experience. Somehow in education, we spend a lot of time to push new ideas into the education system, into the school. And it's very hard. We spend very little energy often to find out where are the good ideas. How can we scale them? How can we spread them? How can we share them? If we would know what teachers and school leaders in education, no, we would have a very different education system almost anywhere now, but that's, I think, a huge challenge. And this brings me back what I'm already mentioned, the degree of stratification in the education system, tracking, sorting, great repetition, where Belgium is really pretty much on the left side of it, is a huge impediment to the quality of the student-teacher relationship. One of the things that, people always look at PISA scores, how well do students score, and so on. But one of the things you should not lose sight of is that in Belgium, and that is true particularly in the French community, many students feel that their relationship with their teachers is not very strong. They say, my teacher doesn't know what I could be doing. My teacher doesn't understand how am I different. My teacher doesn't help me when I really need help. And that quality of the student-teacher relationship is a very important predictor for the well-being of students and ultimately for their performance. I don't want to blame teachers for this because the work organization doesn't support that. Now, again, this very fragmented way of learning with little courses and subjects is not conducive to this, but I do think it's a problem that you need to tackle to improve. When you look at the countries that did best on our comparisons, and that's true both for academic performance and student well-being, they're very demanding for every student. That's what I mean by rigor. They teach fewer things at greater depths. They help students think across the boundaries of subject disciplines. They have learning environments that are thematic, that are problem-based, that are project-based. I know one of the biggest challenges of your country is the large number of students who just, say goodbye to your school. They just drop out, they leave school at some point. And it's often an issue of relevance. Now, students who do not see that what they experience in school is adding meaning to their lives. One day they leave school. No? And if you would run a supermarket and not a school, and you would find, every day from 100 customers, 40 walk out and don't buy anything. And you see that, today, tomorrow, in a week's time, in a year's time, you would change your inventory. No? You would change the way you operate. You would change the kind of learning environments. In school, we have a very, very hard time with this. No? How do I say this? I can say, for example, in the case of Belgium, a lot of the learning in classrooms is about the reproduction of subject matter content. Memorization is the most dominant learning strategy reported by Belgian students on the PISA. But memorization is a strategy of the past. The world no longer rewards us for this. It's about engaging students, building inspiring learning environments. That's the only answer to dropout. No? Dropout is not about, closing school gates and building fences around schools and making compulsory education longer. You can do all of that. But ultimately, it's about making learning relevant. Very, very important challenge. These are the learning environments for the future. And that brings me back to teacher professionalism. I mentioned already. It's about teacher knowledge. What do teachers know about the subject, about the students, about the learners, about how students learn? To what extent are teachers creative designers of innovative learning environments? And again, I think your empowerment plan for schools, the fact that schools will develop their own development plans, creates that opportunity. It's not about the government is going to tell me how to teach. It's about, let me think about it with my colleagues. How can we change things? I think it's very important. And the collaborative culture. And let me just, highlight one piece of data on this. When you look at actually the degree of collaboration on the surface, you can say, well, teachers are very social people. They spend a lot of time walking with each other, sharing practices, going to conferences and things like this. But when you look a little bit deeper, the kind of teacher professionalization and collaboration that really make a difference, observing somebody else's class, engaging in joint professional development, team teaching. Those things are very, very rare. We don't have the opportunities for teachers to work and share their own practices. And why do I say this? Because that's one of the most powerful predictors for the sense of self-efficacy of teachers. The more teachers observe other teachers' classes, the more they engage in joint professional, activities, and team teaching, the more they are trusting their own abilities of teachers, the more they are satisfied with their job, and the more they are basically ready for the future. I know, in the Pacte, you're going to devote 2 hours per week to those kinds of collaborative initiatives. And I think this is a great start, but it's a start. If you were a teacher in Singapore, you would spend well over 100 hours every year on those kinds of activities. If you're a teacher in Shanghai in China, you'd spend 240 hours on teacher professional collaboration. You work every day with other teachers to think about, how can we change things? How can we work together to frame new practice? You'd every week spend hours observing other teachers' classes. You would be a mentor of another teacher, and you would have a mentor who mentors you. Coaching, all of those things are part of the profession, and in our view at the OECD, very important. And that basically, you take those three things together, knowledge, autonomy, and collaboration. That's what the teaching profession is about. And remember, that's not just determining what students learn and how well students learn, but remember, it's also the most important predictor for teacher job satisfaction. We talk a lot about making teaching financially more attractive, and I'm sure we could do more. Now, there's no reason why teachers are not getting as well paid as people with a similar qualification elsewhere. But actually, we should actually think even harder about how do we make teaching intellectually more attractive, not just financially more attractive. And this is what I'm talking about here. This is not about money, this is about the way we work. Very last point I want to make is, how can we actually build environments that encourage innovation in the education system? We survey teachers on this. Now we ask them, if I'm more innovative in my teaching, will the system recognize me for this, reward me for this? And I'm not talking about money, performance-related pay and things like this. I'm simply talking about public recognition. My school principal understanding that I'm doing something different and that I'm trying something different. And you have 1/4 of the teachers saying yes and 3/4 of the teachers saying no. That's only a perception. That may not be the reality. But if we cannot change that perception, we will not change anything. Once again, I think lots of food for thought. I want to say that I'm very impressed how you're taking on those challenges. I think, the Pacte as an instrument to give education back to society, to the profession, to actually lead education in a way that is not connected to the day-to-day ups and downs of public policy, but that actually transcend time and that builds a long-term trajectory, keeping in mind that many of these things will take many, many years, particularly when it's about changing mindset. I think it's a fantastic platform, and count on the OECD to help you make change happen. Thank you very much.